everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Before I was of driving age, summer vacations with friends and family were always the highlight. A time to go out and explore, become temporary residents in places that aren't quite home but feel like it. And of course, once my friends and I could finally drive ourselves around, we found ourselves exploring our town in a whole new way, not waiting for vacations to have all the fun. I've always enjoyed experiencing new things, new places, but I'm talking about the good times, of course. Nice, innocent fun. What could possibly happen in your own backyard, so to speak? Well, quite a lot, apparently. And as for some of those nice lakefront vacation homes in those sweet small towns, well, sometimes you run into situations that aren't so nice and people who aren't so sweet. Tonight's stories remind us that whether we're at home, on vacation, or driving in our car, the spooky never rests. So, let's get started, shall we? We moved about 4 months ago into a temporary place while we build our forever home. This is an older single-wide trailer, probably 1980s, that's been updated inside. It's cheaper, so it helps with building expenses. Anyways, my son's room is on one end of the trailer, ours on the other. We frequently go to the bathroom throughout the night, next to his room. Several times now, we've went to use the restroom and heard my son giggling, talking to himself. In complete darkness, by himself. Sometimes you can hear what he's saying.
That tickles. You're funny.
Etc. My significant other says he's heard him around 3 or 4 a.m. most times. I've heard him around 5 or 6 a.m. My son stays with my ex-husband half of the week. We have a 50-50 custody split. When my son isn't here, we've heard things from his room. My significant other has heard giggles, muffled talking. Toys randomly come on. However, we always find logical reasons to dismiss it. We live next to a 24-hour gas station about 20 yards from my son's window, and figure it's people talking over there. Plus, we have 2 cats that may sneak in his room and knock on toys. That being said, this morning, my son told me that there's a boy in his room, and he tickles him. It totally has me freaked out. Backstory on my son. He's 5 years old, and he's diagnosed with autism. He was nonverbal until last year. We do struggle with complex conversations, so asking him to describe what he sees just doesn't work well, yet. He's a very happy, loving child. Since moving, he seems to be acting the same, just issues at night, where he's awake, which is causing him to be sleepy during the day. So, ghost, imaginary friend, just hoping someone has had a similar situation. Our home is projected to be done in September, so we will be here for several more months. I wanted to provide an update. I've been doing some digging, talking throughout our small community. Apparently, a 10-year-old girl passed away from cancer in the home. Also, many drowning deaths have occurred in the river that runs behind the home, and a car accident in front of the home where a woman was killed. I grew up in a small town in Texas and lived in a house with my sister and parents. My parents weren't right for each other, and they would divorce when I was 8 years old. In the same year they divorced, something would happen to me in that house. that I'll never forget. I've never been as frightened as I was that night. This is what I experienced. First off, the layout of my room. I had bunk beds as a kid. Why? I don't know. The bottom bunk was always empty. Never had any bedding on it except for that plastic mattress cover you'd put on kids' beds in case they wet the bed. Anyway, when you walked into my room, there was a wall in front of you, and the square room opened up to your right. In the opposite corner from the door was my bed. The bed was elevated, laying perpendicular to the bottom bed. The foot of the bottom bunk stuck out, about 4 feet past the top. There was a ladder directly to the right of the bottom bed to climb up to the top as well. The bed was made of real wood and was known to creak a lot, even when the temperature in the room would change due to AC or heat. I also had a glowworm nightlight that was plugged in about a foot from the door. It was a dim light, but there was enough light for me to see if I needed to go to the restroom. Initially, the bed creaking would scare me, but I got used to it over time. On this night, I'm lying awake in my bed, listening to my parents have an argument. Nearing the end of their marriage, they were arguing rather loudly and longer than usual. The bed had creaked a few times as the AC began to cool the room down, but I wasn't fazed until I heard a different sound, a deep, weighted, familiar sound. Familiar because it was the sound the ladder would make when I would step on it. A lot different tone than when the ladder would settle. I was initially startled, but I gave myself a pep talk about how I wasn't a baby anymore. I shouldn't be scared of noises at night. I was able to calm my nerves until I heard the exact same sound again, and then again, in a rhythm, as if someone was walking up the ladder. With each step that was taken, I became increasingly more anxious. By the 4th footstep, I'd sunk into my mattress, clenching the sheets with my hands. I was petrified. Okay, someone is definitely walking up my ladder, I thought. Like children do, I determined, on the count of 3, I was going to quickly lean over the side of the bed to see what it was. You know, because I was going to scare whoever it was. 1, 2, 2.5, 3. I jerked to my left and leaned over the side of the railing to surprise this mystery person. There was nothing there, just an empty wooden ladder. I shook the ladder, assuming it was just the wood settling, making sure all of its creaks were out. There, I thought, assuming I'd fix the issue all by myself, like a big boy. As I lay there, recounting what had happened, I thought, no, I know what I heard, and it was not normal sounds. I'm not being a scaredy cat. I was glued to my bed, afraid to move. Something is in here with me, I whispered. My parents were still arguing. I decided to focus on what they were saying and not what was happening in my room, just to ignore and avoid it. As if this presence was not to be ignored, I heard another sound, another heavy, distinct sound, the sound of someone standing, laying, or otherwise putting their weight on the bottom bed. The box springs on these beds were old enough to make the sound that they were wearing out, and because they lay on these wooden frames, the sound was magnified. And that plastic cover, there was zero doubt about this sound. I know what I heard. There was no mistaking it or kidsplaining this one. This time I apprehensively leaned to my left to peek over the side of the railing, staying as close to the mattress as possible. Normally, if I looked over the side onto the bottom bed, the nightlight would illuminate the plastic cover, enough to see that it was a white opaque, no other colors or shades present, just uniformly white. If there was something left on the bed, the nightlight would cast a shadow from the object across part of the mattress. When I peeked over the side of the railing to investigate what I heard, I could see that the mattress cover was all white, except for 2 large dark spots, 2 shadows, right next to each other. Yet no clothes or toys were on the bed. These 2 shadows were distinctively shaped. They were footprints. You could see the mattress cover sunk into the mattress, clearly, with ripples, creases in the cover where it was being stretched. There was absolutely no confusing what I was looking at with any other explanation. I came unglued. I jumped back as far into the corner of the bed as possible, up against the wall in the far corner of my room. Knees tucked into my chest, arms holding my knees. I started screaming at the top of my lungs. "Mom! Mom!" I was shaking in terror. Within seconds, my parents had ended their argument, burst in the door, and flipped the light switch on. They kept asking me what happened, but I wouldn't say. Was it listening? Would it come back to get me if I told? I said nothing about what happened, continued to cry and shake uncontrollably. I slept in their bed for the rest of the night. The next morning, they asked me again what had happened. I explained that I had just wanted them to stop fighting, fearing whatever it was would come back for me. I've never been more scared in my entire life. I'll be 40 this year. It was so real. There was no mistaking what I saw and heard. Had there been any explanation for what happened, I surely would have just forgotten about it. Years later, in my 20s, I asked my mother if she remembered that night. I explained that I had screamed for her, crying and shaking, and wouldn't tell them anything. She looked at me and said, "Yeah, I do. When you screamed, we honestly thought someone had broken in and was stabbing you." I know that's dark, but that's what it sounded like. Though I don't recall this, she said my father had brought his gun into the room. I explained to her what had actually happened that night. She just stared at me the whole time, wide-eyed. Are you fucking kidding me? I had 2 separate things happen to me in that house too. No shit. This is how my mom talks, by the way. She proceeds to tell me a story about making lunches for us to take to school, and the bread being moved to the floor when she would turn around to get something from the refrigerator. The other story, it's reminiscent of the movie I've seen, Poltergeist. She said dining room chairs were moved on top of the table multiple times. It may be true, but I just didn't feel the same energy from her as the first story she seemed more passionate and certain about. They could both be fabricated because my mom is weird, but there's no doubt in my mind what occurred that night in my room, and I'll never forget. This is something that happened a number of years ago when I was living in an old house that dated from around 1900, seemed to be mildly haunted. My cat liked to play and run up and down the long hallway of the shotgun shack, and she seemed to be playing with some kind of spirits. They were never clearly visible to me. The most I ever saw were vague orbs of light. There were also occasional breezes from nowhere that would move curtains, but I usually dismissed those as just being an old, drafty house. One day, I was trying to recreate a sound someone else in my band had heard during a supernatural experience. When I managed to create a waveform on my synthesizer that they felt matched, it had a strange effect on the synthesizer. every other key on the keyboard ended up with its own unique and odd sound that didn't match the waveform I'd just created. This should not have happened. I created one waveform that should have mapped over the keys in different pitches. It should not have created a bunch of different sounds for each key. As we continued to work on the piece, I saw something invisible lift a curtain that was hanging in a doorway to enter the room. We decided to run with that theme, and the song ended up being about ghosts. Yesterday, I spent my entire day at work reading other people's stories, and now I want to share mine. My best friend Marie and I were 12. Her family had a campsite at a provincial park 2 hours away from our hometown. They spent each summer in a camper out there, and this summer I was able to spend a week with them. On my last night there, we hurried to the ice cream shop before it closed. It was early evening, and we were just starting to lose light. The path was down a short slope with 10 feet of thick brush between it and the road. On the other side of our path was the forest. We walked along, not seeing anyone else. We hear a sudden rustling and snapping of branches, similar to the sound of maybe a deer moving through the woods. I wouldn't have thought anything of it, but then the sound of running footsteps follows. Marie glances back and suddenly grabs my arm, urging me under her breath not to look back. At the same time, the running stops. I don't know why I didn't ignore her and just look for myself. I guess I could sense the very real fear in her voice and chose to listen. We both start to panic, getting that feeling like you're running up the stairs after turning off the basement light. We pick up speed as much as we can without breaking into a sprint, knowing that the ice cream shop is only about a minute walk from this point. The path soon breaks, and we're in the parking lot. Suddenly, Marie steers me hard to the left, heading toward the lake and the boat rental, instead of continuing straight to the ice cream shop, and I go along with it, silently, understanding ice cream is no longer an interest right now. Marie is clearly panicking at this point. We're both looking around, but it seems that whatever scared her is nowhere in sight at this point. Marie walks up to the boat rental and gets us a kayak. We climb in and we begin to paddle out into the middle of the lake. As we paddle, she tells me there was a man behind us, and that the man had stopped running at us very abruptly upon making eye contact with her. He'd been wearing a long black coat with a hood up, despite it being the middle of July. He had a terrible smirk on his face, and she swore that as he stopped running, she saw him put something shiny away into his coat. He appears to have just emerged out of the bushes after we walked past, given the sound we heard right before he came running onto the path. We reach the center of the lake and stop paddling. I pull out my Nokia brick phone that my parents, thank God, had given me just in case. I hand it to Marie and tell her to call her parents to come pick us up. As the phone rings, I see her look out past me to the shore and go pale. Lifting a hand to point to what she's seeing, I turn, and there was the man, stalking his way around the path that circled the edge of the lake, staring out at us. We sat in the middle of the lake and watched him do 2 full laps, never looking away from us, before finally disappearing. It took a few tries to get a hold of her family. We were freaking out so bad the whole time as the sun got lower and lower. We did manage to have someone come with the truck, but by the time we reached the shore, it was pretty dark outside. I don't know what we would have done if we hadn't been able to call for a ride. Looking back, I don't know why we didn't just go to the ice cream shop inform an adult there and ask her parents to come get us then. But it worked out. We got back safe, and we thankfully never saw the man again. When I was a kid, we'd drive 12 hours to visit my grandma twice a year. She had an old house in the middle of nowhere in South Carolina. The only other building near her was an old mechanic shop down the road. My mom has always been weirdly into spiritual stuff and paranormal investigations. She used to take pictures in the dark, trying to capture a ghost. Every time that we would get the film developed, there'd be tons of dark photos taken in all sorts of locations. She'd point to dust particles and say that they were orbs, while my dad would laugh and say it was only dust. One night at my grandma's house, I was looking for a toy in her bedroom. The lights were off, and it was really dark in there. It's weird that I went in there at all. I used to be really afraid of the dark. I saw 2 dancing lights on the front of the dresser, and I almost shit myself on the spot. I ran to my mom in the kitchen and told her what I saw. Of course, she ran to get her camera and started snapping pictures, but there was nothing there anymore. It was probably just a reflection or something, but Mom still took tons of photos. She developed the film when we got home, and the pictures were all normal, except for one of the wardrobe. And that one, it had 2 bright lights on it. They looked nothing like the dust particles in Mom's other photos. I showed that picture to my friends for years after, but unfortunately, Mom was also a hoarder, so it was eventually lost. I kicked myself for not keeping it in a safer space, but I was just a kid. Still, I think that what happened is really cool, even if people don't believe me when I tell them about it. An entity has been hanging around my room since I moved in 2020. It's not malevolent, it's actually quite kind. My friend Cass has felt it hug him, and he's overall comforted by the entity. An hour ago, Cass and I drove to a secluded spot I'd been wanting to visit at night. It seemed like a good place to smoke. When we were talking about it, we started smelling cherries with a hint of cigar. When we made the last turn for our destination, there was a downed tree in the road. It didn't block the way completely, but the gap was too small for my car, so I turned around and used a back road instead. The back road was a small 1-lane that cut through a thick forest. There was no service and very few houses. We were talking along the way, and as we crossed the bridge, I pointed to a spot that I wanted to take him to next time. Just after I looked away, he saw something strange and asked if I saw it too. I assumed it was an animal, but I hadn't seen anything at all. Cass said it looked like something crossed the road, and we both felt an intense sense of dread. I stopped the car, took a moment, and was suddenly certain we weren't supposed to be there. I turned around, but the dread only grew more intense until we crossed the bridge. After that, it eased up a little, but it didn't go away entirely. I stated that whatever we sensed wasn't allowed to follow us home, and it wasn't allowed on my property. The feeling finally started to disappear then, but we kept seeing shadows along the side of the road. As I drove along, a white truck zoomed up to the stop sign on the side of the road and pulled out directly behind us. This didn't concern me until I saw it tailing the hell out of us in the rear view. I alerted Cass, and he said that the truck gave him a bad feeling. When we got to the stop sign at the highway, I didn't use a blinker, but the truck did, and it was going the same way. After making the turn, I waited a few seconds before looking back, and it was gone. It had disappeared into thin air. The drive home was silent. Cass waited until we got back to talk about what happened. I was telling the story to a friend on Discord and asked Cass to describe what he saw, if it walked on 2 legs or 4. But he said it didn't have any legs. It was brown, and it just looked like a singular head crossing the road. It was taller than my closet door, but he didn't know what its body looked like. I asked if it could have been a bat, but he swears it couldn't have been. During the drive home, we both noted that it felt like there was a hand on each of our shoulders. He pointed out the log in the road, that it could have been a sign not to go, along with the friendly entity appearing in my room beforehand. I think this was a Wendigo. Two years ago, I was 19 and taking online classes while staying with my father during quarantine. My father and uncle started going out to see friends on Thursday nights, and Dad taught me how to use his gun in case of an emergency. My uncle's warehouse is attached to our home, and it was recently broken into. Between the warehouse and the house is a piece of land where my uncle parks his truck. And that Thursday, almost a week after the break-in, I was pretty nervous. But I knew it was a way for him to de-stress, so I just asked him to come home early. 2 hours later, my uncle called to say that he left his truck unlocked with the keys inside. It was midnight. I went outside with only my phone for a light. I took the gun with me, but only because I thought that I might need to use it on an animal, not a person. We have some dangerous feral dogs around here, and I've been attacked by one. 10 yards away from the truck, I heard heavy steps. It definitely wasn't an animal, at least not a dog. I ran, opened the truck, and in total desperation, shot at the ground. I heard it drop to the ground, but there was no cry of pain, not from an animal or human. I jumped into the truck, locked myself in, and cracked the window, hoping to hear anything. But all was silent. Almost crying, I called Dad, and he said to use the headlights to see what I shot. I turned them on, but there was still nothing. I couldn't even see where anything dropped in the tall grass. Dad came home minutes later, and he tried looking for blood, but he couldn't find anything either. This wasn't our first weird experience in that house, but it was the creepiest. Now I can laugh about it, and my uncle jokes that I shot a ghost. Does anyone know what else it could have been? This is one of my favorite stories to tell. I was too young to remember it firsthand, but my grandma told me about it. When I was 4, my grandparents moved into the house that we live in now. Their old house sold quicker than expected, so they were pressed for time to find a new one. The first showing of our house seemed normal, so they returned the next day and found a dead crow in the living room. The doors, windows, and chimney were locked. They had no idea how the crow got inside or how it died, but they looked past it and bought the house anyway. On our first day in the house, Grandma and I were going to sleep in the living room while Grandpa and the dog were going to sleep in the master bedroom. At 11, Grandma went to the bathroom. Soon after, I followed to tell her a strange man was in the living room and he wanted to talk to her. This obviously freaked her out, and when no man was there, she still double-checked all the doors and windows. At 4 the next morning, the dog woke up Grandma and I by licking our faces. When Grandma asked Grandpa why he let the dog out of the bedroom, he said that he had no idea how the dog got out. I also had a magnet that you had to push to light up, and Grandma once came home to find it lighting up on the fridge. Too scared to stay inside alone, she sat on the porch until Grandpa came home. Over the next couple of weeks, the oven and TV would randomly turn on and off. We could always smell whiskey and cigars, even though none of us smoked. And Grandma, she always felt like she was being watched. One day, while Grandpa was doing yard work, a neighbor asked him if any weird stuff had happened to us. Grandpa said that it had and asked how the neighbor knew. Apparently, the last owner died of alcohol poisoning in the master bedroom. The house was sold by the owner's mother, so she wasn't required to disclose the information. Sometimes a door will open if we talk about him, but he's pretty friendly overall. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode, but don't miss a brand new one every Friday night, and my other weekly uploads every Sunday and Wednesday. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to The Darkest Hour if you haven't already, and tap the bell so you never miss a thing. Also, talk to me in the comments. A huge shout out to all of my patrons whom I appreciate so much. TRACY S, TAMARA K, Monica L, ZOEWATT, Shelly B, Donald C, Rat Girl, ALISHA S, ERIN G, NIKKI H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendan G, Paul T, and Nicholas C. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining my Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and a big thanks to all of you for listening. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.